Today, Socks and I are going to be conducting an ultralight backpacking stove showdown with two of the more widely used backpacking stoves that ultralight backpackers use. So if you're like me and you're too cowardly to cold soak all your food, then stick around and let's see how these two stove systems compare to one another. The first stove system that we're going to take a look at is an alcohol stove system. And there are so many different alcohol stoves out there that you can choose from, but I'm going to use this one because this is what I actually use in my backpacking setup. This is the Starlight stove from Zelf Stoves, and I really like this particular version of an alcohol stove for a few reasons. One, it's relatively cheap, as any alcohol stove should be. Two, it's really lightweight. It's about half an ounce or 15 grams. And three, it doesn't spill alcohol. So it has a wicking material inside so that whenever you put the alcohol in, then you can flip it over and it does not spill out. The stove that we're going to be comparing to the alcohol stove system is this BRS 3000T model stove. And a lot of ultralight backpackers use this stove because it is also really cheap and readily available online. And it's also really lightweight. So this comes in at about 0.88 ounces or 25 grams. All right, let's check out the accessories and fuel for our two different stove systems. So for our alcohol stove system, of course, we have our alcohol stove. We have a windscreen. I just use heavy-duty aluminum foil. That works fine for me. It's cheap and it's lightweight. I have a plastic bottle that holds the fuel with a no-leak lid, and a measuring cup to measure how much fuel I'm actually putting in the stove. Now, the fuel that I use for the alcohol stove is this denatured alcohol. It's really readily available at hardware stores and big box stores, and it's incredibly cheap for how much fuel you actually get. For the BRS 3000T stove, the only accessory that I would use with this stove is the fuel canister itself. So this takes canister fuel, and these fuel canisters come in different sizes. This is kind of the medium size today for reference. Both of these stove systems are relatively comparable in the way that they pack down into my pot. I use a 900 milliliter Toaks titanium pot, and both of these, with their accessories and fuel, pack into this pot just fine with the help of this pot holder to cinch everything down. All right, let's test these two stove systems out to see how fast they are and how efficient they are at boiling water. Here's how it's going to work. So I have 2 cups of water measured out, and I've actually weighed the water to make sure that it's exactly consistent across both runs. I've also measured the temperature of the water to 60 degrees Fahrenheit to make sure that the starting temperature is also consistent across both runs. In the first run, we're going to test out the alcohol stove. I'll put a half ounce of fuel in it because I know that's about how much fuel it takes to boil water. And in the second run, I'm going to be using the BRS 3000T, and I'm going to be measuring the fuel canister before and after boiling water to see how much fuel we've used. All right, let's get started. Okay, here I am preparing each of the stoves to light. You can see on the left-hand side, I am measuring out the amount of alcohol to pour directly into the alcohol stove. And on the right-hand side, I just clicked the pot supports into place and screwed the BRS 3000 onto the canister. And now both of these stoves are ready to light. And you can hear one of the biggest differences between these two stoves, which is actually the amount of noise that they make. The alcohol stove is nearly silent, and the canister stove is pretty noisy because that fuel is under pressure whenever it's coming out. You can see the timer across the bottom keeping track of the time. And since we know that a washed pot never boils, let's step away and take a look at a comparison sheet, and we'll check back in on these runs in a few minutes. Here we have our comparison chart between the Starlight alcohol stove and the BRS 3000T. And you can see that between the weight
of the stove, the accessory weight, and the weight of the empty fuel container, the Starlight alcohol stove has a pretty big edge over the BRS 3000T. It's nearly 3 ounces lighter in total dry weight than the BRS 3000T, and that's one of the big reasons why a lot of ultralight backpackers go with the alcohol stove. The prices of these two stoves are nearly comparable. The Starlight alcohol stove is $18 at Zelf Stove's website, but there is a $4 shipping fee, and the BRS 3000T stove usually hovers right around $17 on Amazon. We'll fill in the rest of our comparison metrics like our time to boil, fuel used, and total weight for a 4-day trip after we figure out how our stoves did in our trial runs. Alright, we are back at the 4-minute mark to check in on our different runs, and you can see me taking the pot lid off on the BRS 3000T, and that is because it has just started ever so slightly to boil. So at the 4-minute and 17-minute mark is whenever I decide to call the run and I turn off the stove. The alcohol stove is still plugging away, so we'll check back in a couple minutes on whenever that one's finishing up. Alright, we are back and nearing the 8-minute mark. You can hear that the alcohol stove is starting to get a little bit noisier, and that is an indication that the water is starting to move around a little bit more inside. So you can see at the 8-minute mark, I take the top off of the pot, and you can see that the water is just so very slightly starting to boil, so we're going to call that 8 minutes.
So how did these two little stoves stack up to one another? The alcohol stove took about 8 minutes to boil 2 cups of water, and that was with 0.5 ounces of fuel. Now this little BRS 3000T stove took about 4.5 minutes to boil the 2 cups of water, and that was only with 0.17 ounces of fuel. So I was really pleased with the efficiency of this little stove. I've never used this before, and that was pretty cool to see. Let's check out another comparison sheet of these two stoves after the test to see which one is more efficient to take on, say, a 4-day trip.
We have our remaining comparison metrics filled in here, and as you can see that when we compare a longer trip, the total weight of these systems become more comparable because of the efficiency and the fuel use of the BRS 3000T. If conditions were similar to my test runs, and if I boiled 2 cups of water twice a day for 4 days, the total weight of these stove systems and the fuel would be almost the same. However, in reality, I can't measure out the exact amount of fuel I would take in the canister, so this might be heavier if I wanted to err on the side of not running out of fuel.
So, has this little test or experiment convinced me to switch to the BRS 3000T stove over my alcohol stove? I don't think so. And there are a couple of reasons. The first is I don't really like to be hauling around the extra weight of the fuel canister. Second, I really appreciate and like knowing exactly how much fuel I have left on a trip and packing exactly the amount of fuel that I need for the trip. And third, I really appreciate how cheap and readily available the fuel is for these alcohol stoves. And I appreciate not having to try to recycle all of these fuel canisters that you go through. Thanks for watching. From one adventure cat to another, happy backpacking.